All right, on to Section 4. The Antinomy of Pure Reason, Section 4, of the Transcendental Problems of Pure Reason, insofar as they must absolutely allow of being solved. To attempt to solve all problems, and answer all questions, would be impudent boasting, and would be so extravagant a self-conceit, as to forfeit all trust immediately. Nevertheless, there are sciences, the very nature of which requires that every question which can occur in them must absolutely be answerable from what is known, because the answer must arrive from the same sources from which the question springs. Here, it is not allowed to plead unavoidable ignorance, but a solution can be demanded. We must be able, for instance, to know, according to a rule, what in every possible case is right or wrong. Because this touches on our obligation, and we cannot have any obligation to do that which we cannot know. Okay. In the explanation of the appearances of nature, however, many things must remain uncertain. Appearances, interesting use of language choice for Kant. And many questions insoluble, because what we know of nature is by no means sufficient, in all cases, to explain what has to be explained. I agree. It has now to be considered whether there exists in transcendental philosophy any question relating to an object of reason, which is unanswerable by this pure reason. Okay. It is now to be considered whether there exists in transcendental philosophy any question relating to an object of reason which is unanswerable by this pure reason. Okay, and that's kind of what we've been talking about, using reason to get to these difficult questions. I think I know the answer, but obviously we know the answer. I'm being facetious. And whether we have a right to decline to furnish a decisive answer by treating the object as absolutely uncertain from all that we are able to know, and as belonging to that class of objects which we may form a sufficient conception for raising a question, without having a power or the means of ever answering it. Now I maintain the transcendental philosophy has the peculiarity among all speculative knowledge that no question referring to an object of pure reason is insoluble for the same human reason. Really? Hold on. Now I maintain that transcendental philosophy has the peculiarity among all speculative knowledge that no question referring to an object of pure reason is insoluble for the same human reason. Okay, he's talking about like figuring out pure reason in the sense of like, you know, we're not answering any questions about the world. We're just talking about how reason functions in general. So that makes sense. And that no excuse of unavoidable ignorance on our side or of unfathomable depth on the side of the problem can release us from the obligation to answer it thoroughly and completely. For the same concept which enables us to ask the question must qualify us to answer it, considering that, as in the case of right and wrong, the object itself does not exist outside the concept. There are, however, in transcendental philosophy, no other questions but the cosmological, to which we have a right to demand a satisfactory answer concerning the constitution of the object, nor is the philosopher allowed here to decline an answer by pleading impenetrable obscurity. These questions can refer only to cosmological ideas, because the object must be given empirically. And the question only concerns the adequacy of it to an idea. If, however, the object is transcendental, and therefore itself unknown, as for instance in the questions... Did I open the window? I meant to open the window. hold on. These questions can refer only to cosmological ideas, because the object must be given empirically, and the question only concerns the adequacy of it to an idea. If, however, the object is transcendental, and therefore itself unknown, e.g., things in themselves, I think it was what Kant is getting at. As for instance, in the questions whether that something the appearance of which, in ourselves, is our thinking soul, is in itself a simple being, or whether there is an absolutely necessary cause of all things, etc., then we are asked to find an object for our idea, of which we may well confess that it is unknown to us, although not therefore impossible. The cosmological ideas alone possess the peculiarity that they can presuppose their object. And the empirical synthesis required for its concept as given. And the question which they suggest refers only to the progress of this synthesis, insofar as this progress is to contain absolute totality. An absolute totality which is no longer empirical, because it cannot be given in any experience. As we are here concerned solely with a thing as an object of a possible experience, right, appearances, not as a thing in itself, it is impossible that the answer to the transcendent cosmological question can be anywhere but in the idea, because it refers to no object in itself. Okay. And in respect to possible experience, we do not ask about that which can be given in concreto in any experience, but about that which lies in the idea, which the empirical synthesis can no more than approach. Hence, that question must allow of being solved from the idea alone. And as it is a mere creation of reason, reason cannot decline its responsibility to shift it to the unknown object. I think this is I'm not really sure, but I think this is a pretty confusing way of saying, like, reason may be able to tell us about things as appearances, but it can't tell us about things in themselves. So to the extent that we have any questions related to reason in the transcendental sense, gosh, I'm using terms that I probably that are above my pay grade, but yeah, to the extent that we have questions about our appearances, things as they appear, then we should be able to use reason to deduce them. But once we start asking bigger questions beyond appearances, things as we experience them, as you know, as they are funneled through our, whatever, the synthesis of the unity of the synthesis, etc., then reason's fine for that. But because that requires reason, it hinges upon that existing, the whole system. But insofar as we're asking things about things in themselves that can't be experienced, yeah, that's not possible. It is in reality not as strange as it may seem at first that a science can demand and expect definite solutions to all the questions belonging to it, although at present these solutions may not as yet have been discovered. There are, in addition to transcendental philosophy, two other sciences of pure reason, one speculative and the other practical, pure mathematics and pure ethics. Okay. Has it ever been suggested that, on account of our necessary ignorance of the conditions, it must remain uncertain what exact relation the diameter bears to a circle, in rational or irrational numbers? Since in terms of rational numbers, this relation cannot be expressed adequately, and in terms of irrational numbers, it has not yet been discovered, it was judged that at least the impossibility of the solution of such a problem can be known with certainty. So the impossibility can be known with certainty. And I think this is what Kant wants to get to for all these questions. Not that, I don't know, never mind. In the universal principles of morals, there can be nothing uncertain. Because its principles are either entirely null and void or derived merely from our own rational concepts. In natural science, on the contrary, we have an infinity of conjectures, with regard to which certainty can never be expected. For natural appearances are objects given to us independently of our concepts. And the key to them cannot be found within our pure thinking, but in the world outside us. Okay, and that's why we can't depend on reason alone to answer the questions. Which makes sense. Excuse me. For this reason, in many cases, this key cannot be found at all, and no satisfactory answer must be expected. The questions of the transcendental analytic, referring to the deduction of our pure knowledge, do not belong to this class, because we are treating at present of the certainty of judgments only with regard to their objects, not with regard to the origin of our concepts themselves. Right, he's talking about our relationship to judgments and potential concepts. So that's possible. As a mode of our thinking or a way things work, but not in regard to like what a tree actually is and whether our concept of a tree like matches a tree. Stuff like that. Like when we start comparing concepts to real things in the world, things in themselves, like that's not possible. Oh, I don't know why I'm yawning so much. I'm sorry. Well, it's because I'm tired, probably. Don't have to be Kant to figure that one out. We shall not, therefore, be justified in evading the obligation of a critical solution of the questions of reason by complaining about the narrow limits of our reason, and by confessing under the pretext of a humble self-knowledge that it goes beyond the powers of our reason to determine whether the world has existed from eternity or has had a beginning, whether cosmic space is filled with beings ad infinitum or is enclosed within certain limits. Wait, so is he saying we can or we can't? We shall not therefore be justified in evading the obligation of a critical solution of the questions of reason. But I think what he's going to say is, like, we know that we can't know these, right? Lastly, whether there's a being entirely unconditioned and necessary in itself. Or, sorry, I'm transitioning to standing. Or whether the existence of everything is conditioned and therefore externally dependent. And in itself contingent. Okay. For all these questions refer to an object which can be found nowhere except in our own thoughts, namely, the absolutely unconditioned totality of the synthesis of appearances. If we are not able to say and establish anything certain about this object from our own concepts, then we must not throw the blame on the object itself as concealing itself from us. For such an object, being nowhere to be found except in our ideas, can never be given to us. Instead, we must look for the real cause of this inability in our idea itself. The idea is a problem admitting of no solution, though we insist obstinately that a real object must correspond to it. A clear explanation of the dialectic within our own concept would soon show us, with perfect certainty, how we ought to judge with regard to such a question. If people put forward a pretext of being unable to arrive at certainty with regard to these problems, the first question which we ought to address to them, and which they ought to answer clearly, is this: whence do you get those ideas, the solution of which involves you in such difficulty? Whence do you get those ideas, the solution of which involves you in such difficulty? Is it, perchance, from appearances, of which you require an explanation, and of which, in accordance with those ideas, you only have to find the principles or the rules of their explanation? Suppose the whole of nature were spread out before you, and nothing were hidden from your senses, and from the consciousness of all that is presented to your intuition. Okay, that'd be cool. Yet, you would never be able to know, through one single experience, the object of your ideas in concreto, because, turning the page, in addition to that complete intuition, what is required is a completed synthesis and the consciousness of its absolute totality, which is impossible through any empirical knowledge. And I think what Kant is getting at here is like, okay, let's say for a single instant, like right now, you were able to kind of consider and experience, know the world in its totality in this current moment. I know I said that twice, but like it's the most important thing. Well, that doesn't help us with like, does the world have a start, or is it infinite, or whatever the dumb questions are? Because in order to do that, you would need to know the entire timeline of the universe. And there's similar examples for all the other questions he's asking. So it isn't even just like perfect knowledge of everything that exists, but it's like now and forever, always consistent in the same way, having existed. So it's just, impossible. Hence, your question can never be provoked for the sake of explaining any given appearance, and, as it were, suggested by the object itself. Such an object can never come before you, because it can never be given in any possible experience. In all possible perceptions, you always remained under the sway of conditions, whether conditions in space or time. You never come face to face with anything unconditioned. Maybe that's a better way to put it. In order thus to determine whether the unconditioned exists in an absolute beginning of the synthesis, or in an absolute totality of the series without any beginning. The whole, in its empirical meaning, is always only comparative. The absolute whole of magnitude, the universe, of division, of origin, and of the condition of existence in general, with all the attendant questions as to whether it can be brought about through a finite synthesis or through a synthesis to be carried out ad infinitum, has nothing to do with any possible experience. You would, for instance, never be able to explain the appearances of a body the slightest bit better, or even just differently, by assuming either that it consists of simple parts, or that it consists throughout of composite parts, For neither a simple appearance nor an infinite composition can ever come before you. Right. Appearances require to be explained only insofar as the conditions of their explanation are given in perception. Right, appearances without what's or what, and what's without appearances are blind, whatever the quote is. But whatever may exist in them, when taken together in an absolute whole, is not itself a perception. Yet it is the explanation of this very whole that is required in the transcendental problems of reason. As therefore the solution of these problems can never be supplied by experience, fair, you cannot say that what ought to be ascribed to the object is uncertain. You just can't say anything about it. Is that his point? For your object is merely in your brain and cannot possibly exist outside it. Hence, you only need to take care. Sounds like Berkeley, right? Hence, you only need to take care to be at one with yourself and avoid the amphiboly which changes your idea into a supposed presentation of an object that is empirically given, and that therefore can be known according to the laws of experience. The dogmatic solution is therefore not only uncertain, but impossible. Preach. Okay. While the critical solution, which may be perfectly certain, does not consider the question objectively, but only with reference to the foundation of the knowledge of which it is based. Yeah, and I think the point, I don't know, I interpret this to mean like, maybe logically we could try to logic our way to whether, I don't know, I should pick one and stick with it, but like whether or not the soul or the soul is simple or things are simple. But that would probably just be based on our definition of simple and complex, and all right, like logic related to those, branching off of those definitions, and that's just like purely linguistic. So maybe we could get to some linguistic, logical answer to those questions, but that does not actually tell us anything about the actual substance, about the actual things in themselves, frankly, or even the appearances, to be honest with you. But yeah, the point is well taken. All right, on to section 5. The Antinomy of Pure Reason, section 5. Skeptical representation of the cosmological questions in the 4 transcendental ideas. I don't think 5 is that long. Yeah, it's a couple pages. We should no doubt gladly desist from the demand to have our questions answered dogmatically. Yes. If we understood beforehand that, whatever the answer might be, it would only increase our ignorance and throw us from one incomprehensibility into another, from one obscurity into a still greater obscurity, or maybe even into contradictions. If our question can only be answered by yes or no, it would seem to be prudent to take no account at first of the probable grounds of the answer, but to consider first of all what we should gain if the answer were given in the affirmative, and what if it were given in the negative. If we should find that in either case nothing comes of it but mere nonsense, we are surely called upon to examine critically our question itself, and to see whether it does not rest on a groundless presupposition, and does not play only with an idea which betrays its falsity in its application, and through its consequences, better than when represented separately. This is the great advantage of the skeptical treatment of questions by which pure reason puts to pure reason. By means of them, and with a little effort, we get rid of a great amount of dogmatic rubbish, in order to put in its place sober criticism which, as a true cathartic, successfully removes all delusion, along with its train, the pretense to omniscience. Okay, By means of them, and with a little effort, we get rid of a great amount of dogmatic rubbish. In order to put in its place sober criticism, which, as a true cathartic, successfully removes all delusion, along with its train, the pretense to omniscience. Okay. I remember cathartic being like a term for resolving the what's it called? Dialectic issues. From like way back. If therefore I could know beforehand of a cosmological idea, whichever side of the unconditioned of the regressive synthesis of appearances it were to join, that this idea would be either too large or too small for any concept of the understanding, then I should understand that it must be empty and without meaning. For since the cosmological idea concerns only an object of experience, which is to conform to a possible concept of the understanding, the object does not fit the idea, whatever I may do to adapt it to the idea. And this must really be the case with all cosmical concepts, which on that very account involve reason, as long as it remains attached to them, in unavoidable antinomy. I always say antimony. I don't know why. For suppose, firstly, that the world has no okay, so he's going to talk about the 4 examples. That the world has no beginning, and you will then find that it is too large for your concept. For this concept, since it consists of successive regress, can never reach the whole eternity that has elapsed. Okay? Or suppose that the world has a beginning. It is then too small for your concept of the understanding, engaged in the necessary empirical regress. For as a beginning always presupposes a time that precedes, it is not yet unconditioned, and hence the law of the empirical use of the understanding obliges you to look for a higher condition of time, so that the world is clearly too small for such a law. Okay? The same applies to the twofold answer to the question regarding the magnitude of the world in space. For if it is infinite and unlimited, then it is too large for any possible empirical concept. If it is finite and limited, you are perfectly right to ask what determines this limit. Empty space is not a self-subsistent correlate of things, and cannot be a final condition. Still less can it be an empirical condition forming a part of a possible experience. For how can there be any experience of the absolute void? But absolute totality of an empirical synthesis always requires that the unconditioned should be an empirical concept. Thus it follows that a limited world is too small for your concept. Secondly, if every appearance in space, matter, consists of infinitely many parts, then the regress of the division will always be too large for your concept. While if the division of space is to stop at any member of the division, the simple, then the regress would be too small for the idea of the unconditioned, because that member always admits of a regress to more parts contained in it. Right. Okay. Sorry, I wanted to reread that to make sure I understood. Like, one gets you to, like, okay, here's the single part, but that single part can always be cut down in half again. But if your answer is, like, there's infinite parts, then there's always another part. to be considered. And so you can't define what... I don't know. I understand that. The regressive division will always be too large for your concept if it has infinitely many parts. Okay. Thirdly, if you suppose that everything that happens in the world is nothing but the result according to the laws of nature, then the causality of the cause will always in turn be something that happens, and this causality thus necessitates a regress to a still higher cause, and therefore necessitates a continuation of the series of conditions a parte priori without end, right? Merely causally active nature, therefore, is too large for any concept in the synthesis of the events in the world. If you admit, in certain cases, spontaneously caused events, right? Therefore, generation from freedom, then by an unavoidable law of nature, the question why still pursues you. And you are forced by the empirical law of causality to go beyond this point, and thus you find that any such totality of connection is too small for your necessary empirical concept. Fourthly, if you admit an absolutely necessary being, whether it be the world itself, or something in the world, or the cause of the world, you place it at a time infinitely remote from any given point of time. Because otherwise, it would be dependent on another antecedent existence, right? Meaning it has to be effectively outside of the timeline, completely, to have caused the timeline itself, and be necessary. In that case, however, such an existence would be unapproachable by your empirical concept and too large to ever be reached by any continued regress. I'll be honest, I want to try a different translation of this. The one Professor Gijsbers reads from seems a little more direct than this one. This feels like a little bit like this too large stuff is a little awkward. I don't really know what he means by that. Could be me. Could be my problem. I get what he's saying, like a thing to, but it is a little clumsy linguistically. But if, according to your opinion, everything which belongs to the world, whether as conditioned or as condition, is contingent, then any given existence is too small for your concept, because it compels you to look about for another existence on which it is dependent. We have said that in all these cases the world idea is either too large or too small for the empirical regress, and therefore for every possible concept of the understanding. But why did we not take the opposite view and say that in the former case, the empirical concept is always too small for the idea, and in the latter too large, so that blame should attach to the empirical regress and not to the cosmological idea, which we accused in being too much or too little of deviating from its purpose, namely possible experience? The reason was this: it is possible experience alone that can impart reality to our concepts. That's like chapter 1. Without this, a concept is only an idea without truth, and without any reference to an object. Hence, the possible empirical concept was the standard by which to judge the idea, whether it be a mere idea and thought entity, or whether it finds its object in the world. For we say that something is too large or too small relative to something else, only if the former is required for the sake of the latter, and has to be adapted to it. One of the playthings of the ancient dialectical schools was the question whether, if a ball cannot pass through a hole, should we say that the ball is too large or the hole is too small? In this case, it is a matter of indifference what expression we use, because we do not know which of the two exists for the sake of the other. But you would not say that the man is too tall for his coat, but the coat is too short for the man. Okay? We have thus been led at least to a well-founded suspicion that the cosmological ideas, and with them all the conflicting sophistical assertions, may rest on an empty and merely imaginary concept of the manner in which the object of those ideas is given to us. On a merely imaginary concept, yeah. And this suspicion may already lead us onto the right track for uncovering the illusion which has so long led us astray. Okay. I'm with you, Kant. The Antinomy of Pure Reason, Section 6. Transcendental Idealism as the key to the solution of the cosmological dialectic. Oh yeah, that's right, transcendental idealism, that's key. Things are appearances, not things in themselves. Sorry, my wife just sent me a picture of my son. It wasn't anything untoward. It has been sufficiently proved in the transcendental aesthetic that everything which is intuited in space and time, and therefore all objects of an experience possible to us, are nothing but appearances. That's right. Immanuel Kant said that. That is, they are mere representations which, in the manner in which they are represented, namely as extended beings or series of alterations, have no independent existence outside of our thoughts. This system I called transcendental idealism. Yes, you did. And he wants to rename it in a footnote. I have sometimes also called this formal idealism in order to distinguish from it material or common idealism. Okay. I might need to go get some coffee. It's 8:50. I'm about to pass out. The realist, in the transcendental meaning of the term, changes these modifications of our sensibility into self-subsistent things in themselves. That is, he changes mere representations into things in themselves. The realist meaning? The realist is a boy, I guess. Sorry, just confused by what that pronoun is referring to. It would be unfair to ask us to adopt that long decried empirical idealism, which, while it admits the independent reality of space, denies the existence of extended beings in it, or at all events considers such existence as doubtful, and does not admit that there is in this respect a sufficiently established difference between dream and reality. Huh. Is that like Berkeley? It doesn't sound like Berkeley. It sounds kind of a little bit more like Locke. I guess nobody can really deny the existence of space. Right? I don't know. Somebody can, I'm sure. Is Harrison Barnes still in the league? That's crazy. Our own transcendental idealism. Sorry, did I read that sentence? Well, let's read it again. Empirical idealism finds no difficulty with regard to the appearances of inner sense in time in regarding them as real things. Nay, it even maintains that this inner experience alone sufficiently proves the actual existence of its object in itself, with all this determination of time. It's ballsy. Our own transcendental idealism, on the contrary, is way better. Allows that the objects of outer intuition may be real, just as they are intuited in space, and likewise all alterations in time, just as they are represented by inner sense, For as space itself is a form of that intuition, which we call outer, and as there would be no empirical representation at all without objects in space, we can and must admit the extended beings in it as real. They're certainly real. And the same applies to time. Space itself, however, as well as time, and with them all appearances, are yet in themselves not things, but representations, and cannot exist outside our mind. And even the inner and sensible intuition of our mind, as an object of consciousness, the determination of this mind being represented through the succession of different states in time, is not the proper self as it exists in itself, or what is called the transcendental subject, but is only an appearance which has been given to the sensibility of this, to us unknown, being. Yes. It cannot be admitted that this inner appearance exists as a thing in itself in any such way, because its condition is time. And time cannot be a determination of anything in itself. In space and time, however, the empirical truth of appearances is sufficiently established. Space and time. And adequately distinguished from a dream. And truth, from a dream. If both dream and truth cohere properly and thoroughly in one experience according to empirical laws. The objects of experience are, therefore, never given in themselves, but only in our experience, and do not exist outside it at all. That there may be inhabitants on the moon, although no one has ever perceived them, must indeed be admitted. But it means no more than that in the possible progress of our experience we may meet with them. For everything is real that stands in a context with a perception according to the laws of empirical progress. Those inhabitants are therefore real, if they are empirically connected with my real consciousness, although they are not therefore real in themselves, that is, apart from that progress of experience. Sounds like Solaris. It's essentially the plot for Solaris. Actually, I don't remember. Yeah. There's like fake people on there, right? And it's like the ocean. Sorry, I don't want to ruin it for anybody who hasn't read Solaris. I clearly don't know what I'm talking about, so could not have spoiled the book for you. Anyway, nothing is really given to us but perception, and the empirical progress from this to other possible perceptions. For appearances, as mere representations, are in themselves real only in perception, right? Which itself is nothing but the reality of an empirical representation. That is, appearance. To call an appearance a real thing, prior to our perceiving it, means either that in the progress of experience we must meet with such a perception, or it means nothing at all. We can't really do that. We can do that for a priori, like space and time, but not for like stuff in space and time. Right, Kant? For that the appearance existed in itself, without any reference to our senses and to possible experience, might no doubt be said when we speak of a thing in itself. We here are speaking, however, only of an appearance in space and time, which are not determinations of things in themselves, but only of our sensibility. Hence, that which exists in space and time, appearances, is not something in itself. Rather, such existences are mere representations, which, if they are not given in us, in perception are not to be met anywhere at all. Okay, this is kind of all just reviewing the transcendental aesthetic, I feel. The faculty of sensible intuition is actually only a receptivity, a capacity of being affected in a certain way with representations, the relation of which to one another is a pure intuition of space and time. Mere forms of our sensibility, and which, insofar as they are connected and determined in this relation, that is, in space and time, according to the laws of the unity of experience, are called objects. Why is he going over this so thoroughly? The nonsensible cause of these representations is entirely unknown to us. True. Wait, the nonsensible cause? Like, meaning, okay. And so we can never intuit it as an object. For such an object would have to be represented neither in space or time, because it's nonsensible, which are merely conditions of sensible representation. See, I got you. And without these conditions, we cannot think any intuition. We may, however, call that merely intelligible cause of appearances in general the transcendental object. The merely intelligible cause of appearances in general the transcendental object, in order that we may have something which corresponds to sensibility as a kind of receptivity. We may ascribe to that transcendental object the whole range and connection of our possible perceptions, and we may say that it is given in itself prior to all experience. We may ascribe to that transcendental object the whole range and connection of our possible perceptions, and we may say that it is given in itself. Okay. Appearances, however, are given in conformity with the transcendental object, not in themselves, but only in experience, and they are mere representations which signify a real object only as perceptions, provided that such perception is connected with all others according to the rules of the unity of experience. Thus, we may say, the real things of past time are given in the transcendental object of experience. But they are objects to me and real in past time only insofar as I conceive that a regressive series of possible perceptions, whether by the light of history or by the vestiges of causes and effects, leads, according to empirical laws, in a word, that the course of the world leads to a past series of time as a condition of the present time. Okay. This series is therefore represented as real, not in itself, but only in the connection of a possible experience, and so all past events from time immemorial and prior to my own existence mean, after all, nothing but the possibility of extending the chain of experience, beginning with present perception and leading upwards to the conditions which determine this perception with regard to time. Okay. If, therefore, I represent to myself all existing objects of the senses in all times and in all space, If, therefore, I represent to myself all existing objects of the senses in all times and in all spaces, then I do not place them into space and time prior to experience. On the contrary, this representation is nothing but the thought of possible experience in its absolute completeness. Sounds like our thought experiment from like a couple sections ago. In this possible experience alone, those objects, which are nothing but mere representations, are given. And if we say that they exist prior to all my experience, this only means that they exist in that part of experience to which, starting from perception, I must first of all advance. The cause of the empirical conditions of this advance, and consequently, what members I may meet with, or how far I can meet with such members in this regress, is transcendental, and therefore necessarily unknown to me. But this cause does not concern us, but only the rule of the advance of the experience in which objects, namely appearances, are given to me. In the end, it is just the same whether I say that in the empirical progress in space I may meet with stars 100 times more distant than the most distant which I see, or whether I say that such stars are perhaps to be met with in cosmic space, even though no human has ever or will ever see them. For even supposing they were given as things in themselves without any relation to possible experience, yet they are nothing to me, and therefore not objects, save insofar as they are contained in the series of empirical regress. Interesting. Meaning like they're only objects to me insofar as they are necessary objects in the infinite expanse of empirical regress to the beginning of time that just exist within the same universe that I do. But that doesn't really mean much. Only in another relation does the distinction of the mode in which one takes the reality of those objects of the senses become important, namely, when these appearances are met to be used for the cosmological idea of an absolute whole, and the limits of possible experience. For this distinction then serves to guard us against the deceptive error that must inevitably arise from the misinterpretation of our own empirical concepts. All right, section 7. It's called the critical decision of the cosmological conflict of reason itself. Critical decision of the cosmological okay. The whole antinomy of pure reason rests on the dialectical argument that if the conditioned is given, then a whole series of all its conditions is also given. Objects of the senses are given to us as conditioned, therefore, etc. Through this syllogism, the major premise, which seems so natural and self-evident, cosmological ideas, have been introduced corresponding in number to the different conditions. In the synthesis of appearances, which constitute a series. Through this syllogism, the major premise of which seems so natural and self-evident, cosmological ideas have been introduced corresponding in number to the different conditions, and the synthesis of appearances, which constitute a series. The cosmological ideas postulate the absolute totality of these series, and thus place reason in inevitable conflict with itself. However, before we show what is deceptive in this sophistical argument, we must prepare ourselves for it by correcting and defining certain concepts occurring in it. Firstly, the following proposition is clear and admits of no doubt, that if the conditioned is given, then thereby the regress in the series of all its conditions is given to us as a task. For it follows from the very concept of the conditioned that through this concept something is referred to a condition, right? Then we can just trace it back and back and back and back. And if this condition is again conditioned, then this something is referred to a more distant condition, and so is referred through all the members of the series. Right. And effectively, in like the final, like whatever the current one is, like all of the previous ones are embodied in some sense. The above proposition is thus analytic and need not fear any transcendental critique. It is a logical postulate of reason, to follow up and extend as far as possible by means of the understanding that connection of a concept with its conditions which adheres to the concept itself. Need some coffee. Further, if the conditioned as well as its conditions are things in themselves, and if the former is given, meaning the conditioned, then the regress to the latter, the conditions, is not only a given as a task, but it is therewith really already given. I think that's kind of the point I was making with the conditions. The condition contains all the conditions, or the conditioned, I should say. And this holds for all the members of the series, the complete series of conditions, and with it, also the unconditioned, are given, or rather, are presupposed in view of the fact that the conditioned, which was possible only through that series, is given. Here, the synthesis of the conditioned with its condition is a synthesis of the mere understanding, which represents things as they are, without asking whether and how we can arrive at a knowledge of them. But if I have to deal with appearances, I'm gonna fucking... No, I'm just kidding. But if I have to deal with appearances, which as mere representations... If I have to deal with appearances, which as mere representations are not given at all, unless I attain knowledge of them, that is, unless I attain the appearance themselves... that is, unless I attain the appearances themselves, for they are nothing but empirical knowledge, then I cannot say with the same sense of the term that if the conditioned is given, then all its conditions as appearances are also given, and can therefore by no means God, I'm gonna have to reread this. Let's just start over now. But if I have to deal with appearances, which you do, which as mere representations are not given at all, unless I attain knowledge of them, like the stars a trillion miles away, right? You're not given, so that you're not given, blah, 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 blah. That is, unless I attain the appearances themselves, right, through intuition, for they are nothing but empirical knowledge, then I cannot say in the same sense of the term that if the conditioned is given, then all its conditions as appearances are also given, and can therefore by no means infer the absolute totality of the series of conditions. Wait a second. Is he saying that, like, if I'm only given appearances of things, and I don't know things in themselves, and things are just presented to me as appearances, then, like, I can't infer the conditions that go into that final thing? Whereas if we had the thing in itself, like, potentially, maybe we could tease out the things the conditions that have gone into it. But that would be weird. It kind of makes sense. Okay, let's reread it. I'm going to take out the parentheses just to make it simpler. But if I have to deal with appearances, which, as mere representations, are not given at all unless I attain knowledge of them, then I cannot say in the same sense of the term that if the conditioned is given, then all its conditions are also given, and can therefore by no means infer the absolute totality of the series of these conditions. I think that's what he's saying, but I'm honestly not sure. For appearances in their apprehension are themselves nothing but an empirical synthesis in space and time, and therefore given only in this synthesis. Right, meaning they're not loaded up with all that other shit. They're just an appearance. Now it does not follow. I think, I'm trying here, everybody. Now it does not follow by any means that if the conditioned in appearance is given, then the synthesis that constitutes its empirical condition should thereby also be given with it and presupposed. For this synthesis first takes place in the regress, and never without it. What we may say in such a case is that a regress to the conditions, that is, a continued empirical synthesis on the side of the conditioned, is required or given as a task, and that there can be no lack of conditions given through this regress. Hence we see that the major premise of the cosmological syllogism takes the conditioned in the transcendental sense of a pure category, while the minor takes the empirical sense of a concept of the understanding applied to mere appearances. Therefore, the syllogism contains that dialectical deception which is called sophisma figura dictionis. I gotta look up the footnote 61. Sophism of a figure of speech. Okay, therefore the syllogism can... This deception, however, is not artificial, but is a perfectly natural illusion of our common reason. It is owing to this illusion that, if anything is given as conditioned, then we presuppose, in the major premise, the conditions and their series on trust, as it were. That makes sense. For presupposing this is no more than to meet the logical requirement for assuming the complete premise for any given conclusion. Right, that makes sense. Meaning if you're given like a final product, you're going to assume that all of the steps that go into making that final product occurred, even if you have no actual experience of that happening. Like if a car just shows up in your driveway, you're not going to think like, oh shit, maybe somebody put it together, maybe something put it together, but I have no idea. But your brain's just going to assume it did. Right? But that's whatever. Let's leave it at that. For presupposing this is no more than to meet the logical requirement for assuming complete premises for any given conclusion. Nor does there exist in the connection of the conditioned with its condition any order of time. But they are both presupposed in themselves, as given at the same time. It is equally natural in the minor premise to look upon appearances as things in themselves, and also as objects given to the mere understanding, in the same manner as it was done in the major, where we abstracted from all the conditions of intuition under which alone objects can be given. But there's an important distinction between these concepts, which has been overlooked. Okay? The synthesis of the conditioned with its condition, and the whole series of conditions, was, in the major premise, in no way limited by time, and was free from any concept of succession. The synthesis of the conditioned with its condition and the whole series of conditions was, in the major premise, in no way limited by time and was free from any concept of succession. Okay. The empirical synthesis, on the contrary, and the series of conditions and appearances, which was subsumed in the minor, is necessarily successive and given only in time. Yeah. Therefore, I had, in this case, unlike in the former, no right to presuppose the absolute totality of the synthesis of the series represented through it in this case. For the former, all the members of the series are given in themselves, without any condition of time, while here, they are only possible through the successive regress, which cannot be given unless it's actually carried out. That kind of makes sense. So the regress theory, like you can eventually trace it back to an original thing, presupposes time, whereas there is no original thing doesn't necessarily presuppose time. It just, because you don't have to like chronologically trace that back. This kind of makes sense. After both parties have been convicted of such a mistake in the argument, they both adopted as the foundation of their cosmological assertions. They might justly be dismissed as not being able to produce any sufficient title in support of their claims. But even thus, their quarrel is not yet ended, as if it had been proved that both parties, or one of them, were wrong in the matter of contention, in the conclusion, although they had failed to support it by valid proof. Nothing seems clearer than that if one maintains that the world has a beginning, and the other that it has no beginning, but exists from all eternity, then one or the other must be right. But if this were so, since the arguments on both sides are equally clear, it would still remain impossible ever to find out on which side the truth lies, and the controversy continues, although both parties have been ordered to keep the peace before the tribunal of reason. Nothing remains, therefore, in order to settle the quarrel once and for all, and to the satisfaction of both parties, but to convince them that, though they can refute each other so eloquently, they are really quarreling about nothing, and that a certain transcendental illusion has mocked them with a reality where no reality exists. We shall now enter upon this way of settling a dispute which cannot be decided by a verdict. Alright, we're going to talk about Zeno. Nice. The Eleatic philosopher Zeno, a subtle dialectician, was severely reprimanded by Plato as a heedless sophist, who in order to display his skill would prove a proposition by plausible arguments and subvert the same proposition immediately afterwards by other arguments equally strong. He maintained, for instance, that God, this God to him was probably nothing more than the world, is neither finite nor infinite, neither in motion nor at rest, neither similar nor dissimilar to any other thing. It seemed to his critics as if he had intended to deny completely both mutually contradictory propositions, which is absurd. But I do not think that he can be rightly charged with this. We shall presently consider the first of these propositions more carefully. With regard to the others, if by the word God he meant the universe, he could not but say that it is neither permanently present in its place, at rest, nor that it alters its place, in motion. Because all places are only in the universe, while the universe, therefore, is in no place. Again, if the universe comprehends in itself everything that exists, it follows that it cannot be similar or dissimilar to any other thing, because there is no other thing besides it, with which it could be compared. If two opposite judgments presuppose an admissible condition, they both, in spite of their conflict, which, however, is no real contradiction, fall to the ground, because the condition under which alone either of the propositions was meant to be valid itself falls. Excuse me. If somebody were to say that If somebody were to say that every body has either a good or a bad smell, a third case is possible, namely that it has no smell. Interesting example. In which case both conflicting propositions would be false. True. If I say that it is either good smelling or not good smelling, then in this case the two judgments are contradictory, and only the former is false. Oh, sorry, hold on, wait. In which both conflicting propositions would be false because it has no smell at all. If I say that it is either good smelling or not good smelling, then in this case the two judgments are contradictory, right? And only the former is false, while its contradictory opposite, namely that some bodies are not good smelling, comprehends also to those bodies which have no smell at all. Right, meaning you have to lump the third option into one of the two options, and then the other is false, I guess. In the former opposition, the contingent condition of the concept of a body, smell, still remained in the conflicting judgment, and was not eliminated by it. Hence the latter judgment could not be called the contradictory opposite of the former. If I say, therefore, that the world is either infinite in space or not infinite, then, if the former proposition is wrong, it's infinite, its contradictory opposite, that the world is not infinite, must be true. I should thus only eliminate an infinite world without affirming another, namely the finite. But if I had said that the world is either infinite or finite, then both statements may be false. Oh, right, because they're not contradictory. For I then look upon the world as in itself determined in regard to its magnitude, and I do not only eliminate in the opposite statement the infinity, and with it may be its whole independent existence, but I add a determination to the world as a thing existing in itself, which may likewise be false. So presupposing that it is a thing in itself is the issue. I guess that's why the transcendental idealism is what fixes this. But I should thus only eliminate... Hold on, I need to start this over. If I say, therefore, that the world is either infinite in space or not infinite, so if it's infinite or not infinite, if the former proposition is wrong, that the world is not infinite, infinite must be true. So that doesn't give us the option if it's either infinite or not infinite. That doesn't give us the option of the world doesn't really exist. It's neither. I should thus only eliminate the infinite world without affirming another, namely the finite. But if I had said the world is either infinite or finite, then both statements may be false, right? Because they're not necessarily contradictory. There could be a third possibility, e.g., like the world doesn't exist, but only as an appearance. For I then look upon the world as it's in itself determined in regard to its magnitude, and I do not only eliminate in the opposite statement the infinity, and with it may be, its whole independent existence, but I add a determination to the world as a thing existing in itself, which may likewise be false. And right, that's how he talks about, like, posing these things as, contradictory. They aren't necessarily true. And in part they're not true because, as Kant pointed out, like, going back to the transcendental aesthetic, if they are, if we don't know them or can't know them as things in themselves, then we can't say anything about them in particular. We're just talking about appearances. So that's like the third possibility that we're not even considering. And therefore, these things aren't contradictory. They're actually three possibilities. The one most important one, which is mostly ignored till Kant came. For the world may not at all be given as a thing in itself, and therefore also not with regard to its magnitude, and so neither as infinite nor as finite. This kind of opposition may be allowed to call dialectical. This opposition I may be allowed to call dialectical, and that of a contradiction, analytical opposition. Thus, of two judgments opposed to each other dialectically, both may be false, because the one does not only contradict the other, but says something more than is requisite for a contradiction. If we regard the two propositions, that the world is infinite in magnitude, and that the world is finite in magnitude, as contradictory opposites, then we assume that the world, the whole series of appearances, is a thing in itself. For the world remains, whether I remove the infinite or the finite regress in the series of its appearances. For the world remains, whether I remove the infinite or finite regress of the series of its appearances. But if we remove this presupposition, or rather this transcendental illusion, and deny that the world is a thing in itself, then the contradictory conflict of the two statements becomes purely dialectical. Yeah, I get it, Kant. I get it. Feels good. And since the world does not exist in itself, independently of the regressive series of my representations, it exists neither as a whole that is itself infinite, nor as a whole that is itself finite. Okay, I get it. I feel like this should have been the first, section of the thing, even if maybe you wouldn't understand it. The world is to be encountered only in the empirical regress of the series of appearances, and nowhere by itself. Hence, if this series is always conditioned, then it can never be given as complete, and the world is therefore not an unconditioned whole, and does not exist as such a whole, either with infinite or finite magnitude. What has here been said of the first cosmological idea, namely, that of absolute totality of magnitude in appearance, applies also to the others. The series of conditions is to be found only in the regressive synthesis itself, but is never found in itself in appearance, as an independent thing given prior to all regress. Hence I shall have to say that the multitude of parts in a given appearance is in itself neither finite or infinite, because an appearance does not exist in itself, right? And the parts are only first given through and in the regress of the decomposing synthesis, and this regress can never be given as absolutely complete, whether as finite or as infinite. The same applies to the series of subordinated causes, and to the series leading from conditioned to the unconditioned necessary existence. This series can never be regarded in itself as being either finite or infinite in its totality, because, as a series of subordinated representations, it forms only a dynamical regress and cannot exist prior to by itself as a self-subsistent series of things. Thing in itself, right? The antinomy, I finally said it correctly the first time, of pure reason, with regard to its cosmological ideas, is therefore removed by showing that it is merely dialectical, and that it is a conflict due to an illusion produced by our applying the idea of absolute totality, which holds only as a condition of things in themselves, to appearances which exist only in our representation, and, if they form a series, in the successive regress, but nowhere else. We can, such a long sentence. We can, however, it's not that long, it's just like so many clauses and subclauses. And we can, however, obtain that from that antinomy a true, if not dogmatic, yet at least critical and doctrinal advantage, namely, by proving through this antinomy, indirectly, the transcendental ideality of appearances, in case anybody should not have been satisfied by the direct proof given in the transcendental aesthetic. This proof would consist in the following dilemma. If the world is a whole existing in itself, whole with a W, then it is either finite or infinite. Now the former, as well as the latter proposition, is false, as has been shown by the proofs given in the antithesis on the one side and the thesis on the other. It is also false, therefore, that the world, the sum total of all appearances, is a whole existing in itself. Hence it follows that appearances in general are nothing outside of our representations, which was what we meant by their transcendental ideality. This remark is of some importance because it shows that our proofs of the foretold antinomy were not mere sophistry, but were indeed well grounded, namely on the presupposition that appearances, or a world of sense comprehending them all, are things in themselves. The conflict of the propositions drawn from these proofs shows, however, that there is a flaw in the presupposition, and thus leads us to the discovery of the true constitution of things as objects of the senses. This transcendental dialectic, therefore, does not favor skepticism, but only the skeptical method. Right, he's worried about just destroying everything, which can point to the transcendental dialectic as an example of its great utility. For when we allow the arguments of reason to oppose one another with perfect freedom, something useful and serviceable for the correction of our judgments will always result, though it may not always be what we were looking for. What a section. What a great... just fascinating. Really good. A little wordy. Some of the sentences are just so long. But yeah, great. Happy to be reading Kant again. I don't think I'm going to get my monthly goal of finishing this by the end of October, but feels good to be hanging out with Kant again.